And now, a closer look.
A sleepy morning, we're out in the boondocks. Stories being told on the red clay. We are family. Get up, everybody, and sing.
Today's segment is titled, Americans Respond to Un-American Separation of Immigrant Families. Nothing brings more people together like a united theme. Yes, we are family. I've got all my sisters with me. This was the undertone for the Families Belong Together March on Saturday, June 30th, which their main rally attracted tens of thousands directly across the White House. And sister rallies flooded the United States of America with civic protesters in all 50 states. And it wasn't just women who displayed civic discontent and action for change. For many, it was families marching for families.
What are we going to do in November?
Yes, urging citizens to exercise their right to vote, and this is what democracy looks like, were common chants throughout the hundreds of marches held not only across America, but around the world, voicing Americans' demands to end the cruelly administered Trump zero-tolerance policy. The demand from these marchers was clear. Stop further separation of immigrant families and immediately reunite the families who have been separated. Although the largest of these marches were held in Washington, D.C. and New York City, there were, however, marches in more than 700 cities across America. Thousands, many for their very first time, marched for all to hear and see their theme, Families Belong Together. Here, too, in Munich, the organization Vote from Abroad orchestrated, along with others, this march, which gathered in the city's center, in front of the largest opera house in Germany, the majestic National Theater. After many speeches and pleas for reuniting immigrant families, this Keep Families Together march then continued through these historic downtown streets until it was precisely positioned directly across from the U.S. Embassy. So when your heart is strained and the only way is to raise your voice so that they can hear you, then it's also common to say, you gotta give 'em hell.
Give 'em hell. Give 'em hell. Give 'em hell. Give 'em hell. Give 'em hell. When your heart beats lonely and you can't see the sun, give 'em hell.
Americans, much like the rest of the free world, take the sacredness of keeping families together seriously, very seriously. I saw so many thought-provoking signs at this Munich march. A couple which got my attention were, "Make America think again," and "France wants their statue back." After all, written on that bronze plaque for the Statue of Liberty are welcoming words from American poet Emma Lazarus, which appear to be especially relevant now. So I will read some of her words. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Let's go now to speak to the person who actually applied for and received the permit for this family march in Munich and hear what securing such a document was like and also about the art of breaking silence. On the phone, I have Katja Schubel. She's a television producer here in Munich. Tell me, have you ever taken out a permit for a march before?
I have not, and I actually thought it would be much more difficult than it was. It was super easy. It just took like 10 minutes, and I didn't even have to print anything out. That was a new experience for me, and I wish I had done it sooner.
Okay, so you're a German citizen, but
That's
I
right.
believe that you have spent many years in the U.S. Is that true? And if so, where?
That's right. I actually spent my childhood in the States, in Virginia, and then switched to Germany, and then switched back to the States for college and for grad school. I went to the University of Virginia, and then after I got my master's degree, I came back to Germany again. So I've been switching back and forth a lot for my whole life.
Okay, so you've been Americanized or you've been exposed to the American culture.
Absolutely. I would actually say American English is definitely my mother tongue. Culturally, it's really difficult for me to sort of draw a line, but Americanized, yes, most certainly.
Did that have anything to do with why you went and secured the permit for this march?
Actually, it's interesting that you should say that. I had never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. I think that it's a very American trait to not take things lying down and to sort of recognize and feel your own power and your own strength. A lot of Americans that I know, and it's definitely something I learned when I was living there, they're self-starters, and it's kind of a given that you can shape your own life and you can shape your own destiny without sounding too corny. So yeah, I think that that's a very American trait, and I think that that side of me was probably the one that Googled the permit and actually filled it out that day.
Okay, my next question is why?
Why? I'm a mom. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I think most parents would understand when I say that it's really difficult not to empathize with the parents at the border. I mean, I can actually feel it viscerally, the pain that they're going through, and their children as well. I mean, my daughter, she has trouble being separated from me for just an hour or two, and that's when she knows that I'm coming back. So I can imagine what these children are going through and how they're being traumatized, and it was just such an intense feeling for me that it was literally impossible for me not to do something. And the first thing I could think of was to register a rally. So that's what I did. What really enrages me the most is that this administration didn't even put the effort in to develop an effective method of keeping track of these children. They, let me repeat that, did not ever think to develop a method that would effectively keep track of these children. And that just blows my mind. And I think that we really need to stand up and say that that is completely unacceptable and make sure that it's rectified as quickly as possible. They had no plan, and that is not who we are. And I don't mean just as Americans, I mean as humans.
So you felt that you had to do something, or?
That's right. I remember actually talking to my fiancé about this and about how difficult it was to feel so helpless. And his answer was, I just can't think about it, otherwise I won't be able to sleep tonight. And I thought that's, I mean, bless his heart, I understand exactly what he's saying, and I feel the same way, but there's got to be more, you know? If you look at what people have been doing these past few months in the States, March for Our Lives and the Women's March on the day of the inauguration, it just
the
opened up a new
largest
avenue
march
for me.
ever in the United States.
That's right. So people are rediscovering their power. And I think that's the most important thing these days, is not to forget how powerful we are, because we're still living in a functioning democracy, and that depends on us stepping up and actually using our voices. And that kind of sounds tired and a little bit corny, but that's exactly what we have to do, and I think it works. And I'm glad to see that there are so many people who are doing that now for the first time, just like me.
Absolutely. Do you have any closing advice for any individuals listening to this program?
It's important to remember that when you say something, it will be heard. So what you're doing when you're saying something or just posting or chanting or debating, you're actually breaking something insidious. You're breaking silence, and that's incredibly powerful. If you're silent, then effectively you're giving your consent. So don't forget how strong you are, how powerful you are. If you see something, speak up. That will change something, even if it's just a small thing. And eventually, things will get better.
Katya, I thank you for breaking your silence, and we wish you and your 2.5-year-old daughter an absolutely wonderful day.
Well, thank you very much. It was glad to be here.
I already know. I already know. I found out how it feels not to be chained to anything, to any race, to any faith, to anybody, to any creed, to any hopes, to anything. I know how it feels to be free.
In America, there are Americans who are dedicated to the rights of immigrants, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, acronym ACLU. One such person there is attorney Lee Gallant, deputy director for their Immigrants' Rights Project. Just days before the Families Belong Together march, Mr. Gallant learned that the lawsuit he filed against the zero-tolerance policy had been issued a preliminary injunction by a federal judge in San Diego, California. It was U.S. District Judge Dana Sobral who wrote, and I quote, "The facts set forth before the court portrays reactive governance, responses to address a chaotic circumstance of the government's own making. They belie measured and ordered governance, which is central to the concept of due process enshrined in our Constitution." What this means is this judgment orders the government to take action for children under 5 years old to be reunited within 14 days and the older children to be reunited within 30 days. So, this means all should have been reunited by around the end of July. But this administration keeps saying it's not possible. Could it be because they never had a reunification plan? Instead of seeing expedient facilitation after Judge Sobral's injunction, immigration attorneys working at the border have been reporting serious pushback in the form of revoking any bail for the immigrant parent once they passed the fear test. Normally, what has been granted was the standard $1,500 bail, which would let them out and find their children. Let's go now and speak with a woman who's been working hard behind the scenes for these Munich marches to get an historical perspective on how such organized marches were not even called for by Americans in Munich until this Trump administration motivated so many to become vocal and organized, creating positive marches for change. On the phone, I have Megan Driscoll. You have been very involved for the past 7 years with an organization called Vote From Abroad.
Yeah, votefromabroad.org. As a U.S. citizen, no matter where you live in the world, you have a right to participate in our elections.
There was a rather big march that went on here in Munich on Saturday the 30th of June called Families Belong Together.
Right.
Can you tell me what your involvement was with that?
This issue of separating families at the border really hit home for a lot of people. We saw a lot of new activists, if you will. And because we have been taking out petitions to walk the streets and demonstrate and hold vigils since this new administration took office, we were able to tap into our expertise and our network of volunteers and network of other groups in the Munich area to all get involved. Yeah, it was exciting. So I was very much behind the scenes on this. We had a lot of new, energized faces take this over, which was exciting to see.
In the last 7 years of you being involved helping Americans to vote from abroad, there really wasn't any organized marches and protests until this administration came about.
Yep. Anything before had been few and far between. I had never been involved in them, for example. And then when this new administration took office, we found ourselves doing the first vigil calling for peace about 2 weeks after the election, November 23rd. And then again, we were a sister march to the Women's March, and we had 1,500 people show up. And these are people who weren't used to marching or taking to the streets. And then again, February 1st, we called for religious tolerance and gathered out across from the U.S. consulate again when we had about 300 people, and that was the first Muslim ban attempt. And then April 14th, again, the Science March with over 4,000 people in Munich in attendance. That brought out Siemens and the Max Planck Society and institutions in Munich. Then again, June 2nd, a few months later, the Vigil for Truth. That was when the Russia investigation started. That brings us back to January 20th, 2018 for the annual Women's March, Sister March that we held again. March 24th, we had the March for Our Lives, a sister march for the gun control march in the States, which I know your radio show also covered. And then April 14th, March for Science. And we're just seeing new people coming out each time. You look around at the community that comes out for these, it's really empowering.
What were the main messages that you carried through these marches?
Well, we found that it's always important to keep it positive. Remind people what we stand for. It's not really enough to come out and protest against. It's about digging in, self-searching, speaking with one another, having those discussions. What is it we're fighting for? What is it we're standing up for? And many times it's as simple and as great as social justice, as human rights, as equality, religious tolerance. A big part of these is showing our local community where we live that we are not okay with the policies and the actions that are being taken by this administration.
Do you have any closing thoughts for listeners out there that feel that they have no platform to stand on?
You know, we did see reaction from the Trump administration after marches started getting underway in the States, and then putting a global aspect to that. That does put pressure on them to change. But ultimately, what we absolutely have to do is restore checks and balances. We need to be voting. Every single person should vote. And if you are a U.S. citizen, no matter if you've never lived in America before and you were born outside of the States, you have a right to vote. And we work really hard to protect that right to vote. So I encourage everybody to visit votefromabroad.org and vote. Vote often, every year, and you have to request your absentee ballot every election year.
Well, Megan, it sounds to me like you are empowering our listeners, especially the American listeners. I thank you for taking time to speak with us and our listeners, and we wish you an absolutely wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Dan. Great speaking with you.
Ain't no sunshine which is gone, and this house ain't no gone. Anytime she goes away, anytime she goes away, anytime.
you want to know if the terror and trauma suffered by children separated from their parents is real or universal, all you have to do is just go ask any parent what they think. In the lawsuit won by attorney Lee Gerlernt, he wrote, and I quote, "Many of the children are babies and toddlers who every night are crying themselves to sleep, wondering if they will ever see their parents again. Some have been suffering from this for months. The determination and compassionate tenacity found in everyday Americans to stop injustice toward their fellow man, whether citizen or illegal immigrant, is more commonly found than not." For example, one couple in California, distraught with seeing an image of a small child standing in panic, was a screaming and crying little Honduran girl while her mother was being searched by U.S. Border Police. This couple decided to try and raise enough money to afford legal help to reunite one such immigrant family. So they created an online fundraiser page with their goal set at, yes, you guessed it, $1,500. By the way, that same image that they saw, which was taken by Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer John Moore, also became the iconic cover with the red background of the July 2nd issue of Time magazine's Trump, Welcome to America, just in time for the 4th of July festivities. Now, that California couple named Charlotte and Dave Wilner not only raised their goal of $1,500, but the donations poured in. At one point, they watched donations pour in at a rate of around $4,000 a minute. And eventually, this couple raised more than, listen to this, $20 million for this fundraiser they call Reunite an Immigrant Parent with Their Child. Through this program and these massive funds which were raised, this could be a workaround to reunite these immigrant parents to their children, since it appears the Trump administration has no plan. But this is only possible if bail is actually offered to the immigrant parent, so they can then be free to go on a search to find and reunite with their child or children. Dave Wilner told his local newspaper that creating the fundraiser was the closest thing we could do to hugging that kid. Let's go now to speak about the trauma of separation for children when taken from their parents with a professional, and also to get a glimpse into how the bigger picture needs to be more closely examined when trying to create real solutions. On the phone, I have the retired American professor and lifelong therapist, Dr. Bob Bender. There are some in the news which state this zero-tolerance policy and compare it to what happened with separations of children from parents in the internment camps that were here in Munich in the 1940s.
That's correct.
What the internment camps in the U.S. are doing is they're telling parents and children that they are only going to give the child a bath and they'll be back later, and then neither the child nor the parent sees them again. People who have interviewed Holocaust survivors usually find one thing in common, that most are usually able to describe the most horrific cruelty without shedding a tear. However, so many Holocaust survivors choke up and do shed tears when they try to recount that moment when they were separated from their parent. What's your take on this? Is it fair to make the comparison or no?
The comparison is not perfect in any stretch of the imagination, but there are certainly some important similarities, and I can understand why people are trying to draw a parallel there.
Okay.
Let me address first the comments you made about the Holocaust survivors, many of them who cannot describe their experience without breaking into tears, and perhaps even a greater number of them who can talk about those experiences in a totally unemotional way.
Okay.
It's as if they're reporting the news or something like that. The general perception or belief is with the differences between these people have to do with how they handled the situation of separation. If they were under great duress and pressure to not express their feelings at the time of the separation, we tend to think that those are people who have been forced and learned how to cope with life by suppressing as completely as possible their emotional reactions to the situations. So that they tend to go through life in robotics, an exaggeration, but in a way that lacks feeling. The people who couldn't be totally suppressed about their feelings are the ones who are sort of in touch with that experience, not just on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level. And they're the people who cannot not cry when they remember the cruelty and the pain and the suffering that they went through in relationship to that. Let me then shift to the examples that you were talking about where children and parents are told, we're just going to take your daughter or your son, they need a shower, and that's how they affect the separation of parent and child without any emotional damage initially. But in the long run, the damage that derives from that kind of separation is actually worse than people having a chance to talk with their children and their children with the parents about the separation and how it's not the child's fault. It doesn't have anything to do with whether I care about you and love you or not. I'll do everything I can to make sure we get reunited as soon as humanly possible, etc. It's as if the knowledge and the safety of the parental love is critically important in preventing the separation from having the long-term consequences that are so negative in so many cases. The people then tend to carry through their lives in a variety of ways without even knowing what the root cause of that emotional distress is. Being loved by your parent is almost universally recognized as one of the critical ingredients in long-term mental health. Let me speak briefly from my experiences in the first professional job I ever had. Several months after I graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology, I went to work in a Midwestern U.S. state as a juvenile court counselor. That was my official title, but fundamentally, the duties that I had were no different than the duties that were performed by people who were called probation officers. And in fact, during the judicial process, if the children were found responsible for breaking the law and there was concern that they couldn't break the habit of breaking the law, that they were then put under the jurisdiction of the court, under the supervision of a probation officer or, in my case, a juvenile court counselor. Some of those cases involved family situations where the normal, quote-unquote, ordinary person would think, geez, we got to get this kid out of there. But I saw a number of situations and experiences where when that did happen, the trauma to both the child and the parent was in fact worse and certainly increased the probability that the child would be angry enough and hurt enough and estranged enough to be much more likely to break the law in the future. Even when the parents seem like bad parents, when they love their children, they're still the most important person in that child's life. Perhaps that's why some of the political reactions to the separation involve so much blaming on the parents, as if they're trying to say that these are people who are lousy parents anyway. They shouldn't even be thinking about bringing their kids here. We have to do this for the good of the child, even implying that there's some kind of almost missionary motivation behind it. I find that kind of logic, at the very least, pretty distorted.
Mm-hmm.
I must say I'm both personally and professionally deeply distressed by the separation of children and parents, even when the parents have crossed the border illegally. And there's another aspect of this whole thing about immigration that I think has not been mentioned very frequently during this period of crisis in the last couple of years. Well, so many of the politicians claim that the people who are trying to immigrate to the United States are the bad people, they're the rapists, they're gang members. In fact, immigrants to the United States have a much less likelihood of committing crimes than do native-born Americans. Most of the immigrants to America historically, and certainly in this present instance, are people who are trying to escape horrific conditions. And if we look back at the involvement of the United States government in both covert and overt activities in Central and South America over the last 100 years, it's hard to escape the notion that much of what the U.S. government did in those countries has added to the destruction of civil society and increased the likelihood that people will be impoverished both politically and materially, and therefore feel this incredible need to seek a better life in another country. That's a factor in this whole immigration process that really nobody I've seen has addressed.
And a very valid and important point that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. I, too, wish more people would address that aspect of the situation.
So going forward, these traumas that children experience can carry on with them into their adulthood. And if they're not aware, or if it wasn't handled and healed correctly, could cause them great despair in their adult life.
That certainly can be an outcome. It's not uncommon. And again, I think it's important to emphasize how a separation is handled. We know, for example, that there are times when people and their children have to be separated.
Correct.
And it doesn't have anything to do with immigration or politics or anything else. We can think of people who have to be separated from their children because of an extended hospital stay, for example. And in those instances, the people who handle it most effectively for both themselves and their children, there's an opportunity for long discussions between the parent and child, depending on the child's developmental level, of course. But again, the emphasis is we have to have this separation. Mommy or daddy has to go into the hospital and might be gone from home for a long time, but they're not going to be gone because they don't want to be with you. They have to be gone for different reasons so they can come back with you and be healthier and love you just as much as they ever have.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the central messages that are conveyed that protect people's mental health. It's too easy for a child to eventually develop the notion that the absence of a parent constitutes a rejection by the parent.
Or even that somehow the child thinks it might be their fault. Of something
Exactly.
they did or did not do.
Why else would my parents reject me?
Yeah.
If I was not a bad kid. People do tend to carry that sense of doubt and uncertainty about their value, if you will, or their worthiness throughout their whole life. And it can be a difficult thing to cope with.
Any closing words of hope for any parents out there listening, trying to minimize the effects of separation trauma to their children for whatever reason?
I think the important thing is, if they know that that might happen, to share the truth with their children, to explain to them that it can't be helped, that this is something that has to happen because we're trying to make a better life for ourselves and for you. And we love you endlessly, and we'll do our very, very best to get back together, no matter what it takes.
And
even when children are separated because of the death of a family member, we try and make sure that the children understand that it wasn't because they didn't love their kids, and it's not the kids' fault.
Absolutely. While actively listening to all that you have shared with us today, not to be too simple in my summary, but it sounds to me like love is still the answer.
It really is.
I thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking time, and we wish you an absolutely lovely day.
Thanks, Nick.
And when you feel afraid, when you've lost your way, and when you're all alone, and when you're far from home, and when you're down and out, and when your hope's run out, and when you need a friend, and when you're near the end, we got to love, we got to love, light up.
There's something awfully unnerving about secret detainment facilities for separated immigrant children, where no press was allowed to enter or film inside these facilities. What's even stranger is that some of these have sprung up almost overnight, like the converted Walmart in Brownsville, Texas, or the tent cities, all done in secret. I saw a report in the New York Times which listed nearly 100 such shelters or camps in cities you'll recognize. Here's just a short list, about a third of them. From Houston to Phoenix, to Seattle to Chicago, to New York City to Miami. And what I find most amazing is the True Grit expose on how many of these facilities have been uncovered by normal, everyday Americans, standing firm in their determination to exercise their duty for exposing injustice by contacting and informing the free press. So, if you're an American or anyone living in a democratic society, and you are asking yourself the question, what can I do to make a difference? Here's a short list of civic actions you can take. First, recognize your outrage, and then become engaged, and stay engaged. Next, participate in local or even virtual demonstrations, and offer your solution to the problem. Register to vote, and most importantly, go out and vote. Write or call your representatives. These are your elected officials to ensure outrageous policies are stopped. Donate, volunteer, write to your local media. Keep the pressure on to keep any such injustice as an ongoing issue. And above all, remain compassionate.
Stand by me. If the sky that we look upon should tumble and fall, or the mountain should crumble to the sea, I won't cry, no, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me. And darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand now. Stand by me. Stand by me.
Under that federal order I mentioned earlier by Judge Dana Sobral, within it also said that parents cannot be detained or deported without their children. The only reason could be if the parent was either unfit or posed a danger to the child or children. So, although this current U.S. administration may decide to do whatever they wish by creating any new, perhaps unconstitutional policy, remember this. There are and will continue to be courageous Americans who will respond in a civil manner to the courts for a legal ruling, just like in the lawsuit which reached the federal courts of appeals back in August of 2002 for the Detroit Free Press versus the then Attorney General John Ashcroft, which sought and won the right to prevent the government from holding secret deportation hearings after September 11th. In this historic ruling, it struck down the government's secret hearing policy, which became known as the Creepy Directive. No joke. The United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit stated something very profound in their ruling against that creepy policy, which is worthy of being repeated again. So I now quote it here for you. Democracies die behind closed doors.
I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps in the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. All around me, a voice was a sounding, This land was made for you and me. There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, said private property, but on the back side it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling. My voice was chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, and this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
On behalf of the folks here at Radio Laura, we hope that we have provided inspiration for taking civic action for any just cause. Keeping all children united with their parents is certainly a worthy cause for letting your voice be heard. The late, great Whitney Houston voiced it so beautifully in her song, Greatest Love of All, when she said it like this: I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way.